Hi, everyone. My name is Bhaskar Sunkara. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin, and I'm sometimes host of these here Jacobin Talks. This channel has been going since April, and we're off to a really good start. We have over 50,000 subscribers now, so please join the march of history, the inexorable progress of this YouTube channel by pressing like and subscribe and sharing our videos on your social media feed. If you are live, by the way, please do say hello in the live chat and participate in our Q&A later. If you're watching this archived sometime down the road, please feed the algorithm by leaving us a hopefully positive comment. So this Wednesday, we have very exciting news. We have a new show launching with Jen Pan and Paul Prescott and Ariella Thornhill. It's called The Jacobin Show. But what we lack, I guess, The Jacobin Show, in the originality of our titles, we make up for in the content. Our first guest is Vivek Chibber, the editor of Catalyst. I think this will be a really lively and engaging show. I think it'll be some of our kind of deep cuts as we get into lots of debates about hopefully giving socialist, Marxist perspectives on politics and culture, economics of the stuff going on day to day in a accessible, fun, pretty short format. So it's a live show. I hope everyone tunes in at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, then every Wednesday for them on. I'm really excited. I couldn't think of three better people to host the show than Jen, Paul, and Ariella. And obviously, we're still doing weekends every Saturday at 1 p.m. We're still going to do one or two of these Jacobin Talks a week, or at least a few a month. And today, we have a particularly good one. I'm joined by two of my friends, two of Jacobin's finest contributors, Ben Burgis, who basically needs no introduction on this channel, especially if you're familiar with the budding world of left YouTube, that he's doing a lot to help build us, and especially this channel. He's on it about once a week. So Ben, thank you for joining us. And we are also joined by Leigh Phillips, who's a science writer at Jacobin and other publications. He's also the co-author of The People's Republic of Walmart, a book that deals with many of the topics that we'll get into tonight. I have it right here, my well-worn copy that you could buy still from Verso and Jacobin and a million different other places. I won't mention Amazon. That was originally a potential title for this book. Someone at Verso wanted it to be called The People's Republic of Amazon way back several years ago when it was coming under contract. And I thought that was, kind of middle-class nonsense, because in fact, Walmart was a much bigger and more relevant company than Amazon, and probably a mistake. It might have sold more copies, especially now, if it was called People's Republic of Amazon. But the lessons still really apply, obviously, and you should check it out.
If you don't want to buy it through Amazon, I should say Red Emma's is a worker-owned bookstore that sells it online.
There's Red Emma's, which is a workers own. There's Powell's, which is a good union bookshop, so you could pick one or the other. So definitely check that out. And the jumping off point for our conversation today is the book Red Plenty by Francis Spufford. Red Plenty is a 2010 book, so it's almost a decade old. That blends together fiction and nonfiction, all sorts of genres, into a, basically it's an excellent novel set in the Soviet Union of the 1950s and 60s. It depicts in the main the days when both the Soviets and some frightful observers in the West thought they were on the cusp of the planned economy overtaking the capitalist world, and at least in the dream of the Soviets, providing abundance, red plenty for all. So the book features real figures like Nikita Khrushchev, but also characters that are composites of some real figures, everyone from mathematicians struggling to optimize the economy and win political support for necessary reforms to the system, to factory managers struggling to meet their quotas and kind of conspiring to get around the system, to black marketeers, to scientists trying to navigate official censorship and still do their work. It really is a kaleidoscope of the Soviet Union during this period. It really humanizes and brings to a human level all these debates and figures. And it's an incredible challenge to write a book about this very foreign period of history, this foreign location, a hero whose protagonist is the planned economy. It's an incredible feat as a work of literature, and it really does work at that level. Obviously, in terms of the content, what really gets us interested at Jacobin is the discussions it prompts, Red Plenty prompts, about the possibility of planned economy, a possibility of socialism, the failures of actually existing Soviet central planning, about what role prices or money or the markets would play in any future socialism, and also about what the point of socialism is, and whether a abundant socialism that is not just about rationing out scarcity is possible. But I really think the overarching lesson is just economics, something that seems so abstract as a 1% change in the unemployment rate has dramatic real world consequences for people, and the things we're advocating for, from short-term day-to-day reforms to more sweeping transformations of the economy, have these impacts. So Red Plenty cannot have any higher recommendation for me. I think especially if you're a lefty. Even if you're not, you should check it out. And if you happen to not be a lefty, but watching this YouTube right now, then, then you're a niche. You're in a very small minority of people, but you probably would like this book as well. So I guess I'll start off by maybe starting with Leigh. And I wanted to start off with the actual novel before we go off into wild tangents, because obviously the point of this talk is to go on for wild tangents for about an hour. But I do want to start off with when you first read the book, how'd you discover it, kind of what your key takeaways, and let's just start with the actual text before we use the text to jump off.
Sure. I read it in 2010, just after it came out. And I was attracted to it by the introductory essays that Spufford. I don't know how to pronounce his name. If it's Spufford or Spufford.
I think it's Spufford.
It's what is it?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Anyway, okay. So
I've listened to 2 different YouTube lectures to see how he was introduced, and I heard 2 different pronunciations. So we'll pick one and we'll be consistent within the Jacobin talks.
Okay.
The official guide.
Yeah, and I'm probably wrong, but so I don't keep thinking about trying to correct myself. The essays that Spufford wrote in The Guardian at the time, these sort of long reads, sort of introducing the book, and I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting, and I was kind of blown away by it. One, because as a socialist, I'm fascinated with the conception of central planning, but also specifically as a science writer, ideas around computational complexity, and but mainly I was quite struck by how it was this remarkable piece of literature that, as you were saying, somehow he makes the main character the idea of central planning, and he does it in a very non-didactic, open-ended, clever way. The writing is rich. The characters are very really well realized. It's moving. It's fascinating. It's full of lots of information, but not sort of info dumps in the way that you get from some sort of Michael Crichton thriller. It's a page turner. I don't know why it wasn't showered with literary awards like the Booker Prize when it came out. It's incredibly innovative as a form-wise in terms of the novel itself. It's great.
So that was very definitive and very concise. I completely agree. I mean, it's like the book was made for our particular interest, but I do believe that it's something that you could send to anyone. Ben, same question. Then I'll take us down the rabbit hole of
Yeah, yeah,
obscure debates that maybe only we care about.
yeah. Fair enough. Well, look, I mean, I read it last year, I guess. So that would have, yeah, like I read it. I think sometime like fall of 2019, and I read it because I was interested in those obscure debates. In fact, it had been kind of vaguely on my radar for a long time. I think I read in Ken McLeod's blog. He had a post about it that like maybe made me curious, years before, so I'd been meaning to read it for a long time. And I read it when I did because I was also reading, I think simultaneously, Leigh and Mikhail's excellent book, The People's Republic of Walmart, and stuff like Verso has this book by Robin Hanhel and Eric Olin Wright called Alternatives to Capitalism, which is devoted to, debating different models for what a post-capitalist economy could look like. And obviously I was really interested in the Soviet history aspect. So that's all the reasons I read it, but I completely concur with what Leigh says about it as a work of literature. Even the sort of like it's a really innovative combination that there are some things in it that are kind of essays, but very literary essays. Most of it is, just narrative fiction, and it's a kaleidoscope of different characters. Khrushchev is a character at one point. And actually, I should also mention I'd read Peter Carlson's book, K Blows Top, a Cold War comic interlude, shortly before that, which covers some of the same ground about Khrushchev's visit to the United States. The title comes from newspaper headlines when Khrushchev was told that he couldn't go to Disneyland because they couldn't guarantee his security, and he got mad about that. But there are also people at every level of the economy, from black marketeers to ordinary workers, to these red plenty dreamers, these early computer scientists who were trying to come up with ways to more rationally plan the economy so they could guarantee that kind of planned that communist abundance, red plenty. And so I think even the sort of slightest narrative pieces of the novel, like even the characters who you see the least of, I mean, it's just so well executed. Like they feel like the little complete Raymond Carver stories or something in themselves. And then the longer ones, are ones that I could have happily read another novel of that size that was, just about those people. So I think it's remarkable as a work of literature. And I also want to, I guess, just end by underlining what Leigh said about how it raises all these interesting issues in a very, non-didactic way. I have a friend who read the book, who's a libertarian, who I think certainly didn't feel like the virtues of economic planning were being preached to him. But, I read the book as a very committed socialist and, didn't feel like anything anti-socialist, was being preached at me. I think that I think it does what good literature, more often does, which is that it explores issues, but doesn't really take positions on them. So it shows you in this kind of kaleidoscope of characters at different places in the economy with, as Bhaskar said, the planned economy as the central character. It gives you a really vivid sense of how that system works and what some of its flaws were and what some of the proposals that were floating around to try to correct those flaws were and what some of the arguments for and against those proposals were. But the novel is not really interested in convincing you that any particular side of that argument is right. It's trying, I think, instead to give you a sense of what's at stake in it.
And also it has like some of the most interesting endnotes of any books that I've read. I just handled the right way, where you could see what's fact, what's fiction, what's a composite character. And from there, you can actually assemble a really good reading list if you want to understand some of the reforms under Khrushchev, for instance, or any of these the real life calculation debates and kind of attempts to push for reforms within Gosplan and things like that. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And I think there's a necessary caveat.
Kale's asleep at the window. You mentioned Gosplan. Okay, thank you.
All right, there we go. Beautiful building. The Stalinist architecture. I will defend it. But the caveat is, we are not proponents at any level of the Soviet system that existed, but especially at the political level, right? The repression, the stifling of basic civil liberties, and so on and so on. So, when we say we should take the Soviet experience seriously, we're saying that we should take the economic successes and failures of the Soviet Union seriously. In other words, if there was a Soviet Union with political freedoms, it would still be insufficient in certain ways. So anyway, I think that's necessary. But for those of us familiar with our work in the channel, we kind of feel like we don't need to just reiterate that we're opponents of Stalinism, but for the sake of posterity, maybe I'll throw that out there.
Yeah, fair enough. I was also going to say, though, I mean, I think that even after Stalinism bad has been said, I think that it's important to like think a little bit more explicitly about why we care about trying to figure out what happened in the Soviet experience. Which is what like Alec Nove talks about in his book Economics of Feasible Socialism, which is that that there's a sort of very cheap way of being an anti-Stalinist socialist, which is to say, oh yeah, well, the Soviet Union had all these failures and problems, but that's because it wasn't the real thing, because because they didn't, it wasn't, real socialism, and some of the reasons for thinking that might be good ones, like it didn't have that radically democratic stuff that we get excited about when we think about what socialism could look like. But that's also a very cheap evasion in some ways, because what Nove points out is that oftentimes when people make these critiques, what they're comparing the Soviet Union to is something that's so poorly thought out and under-conceptualized that it's not obvious that it's even possible. Like they're just sort of saying, no, well, instead of the Soviet Union, we'd like to have a society that had all the good things and none of the bad things, please. Whereas I think if you want to think about, a kind of socialism, socialism in the sense of being radically democratic, in the economy, so we agree with what those kinds of anti-Stalinist socialists are saying on that level. But if you want to think about such a system that didn't replicate the failures of the Soviet Union, you need to think hard about why those failures happened in the first place, instead of just saying, well, that was Stalinism, not real socialism, case closed.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Leigh, is your connection okay? I was going to throw it to Leigh, but maybe I should wait a second, because he seems to be frozen on my screen in time until he rejoins. Okay, so I guess I'll throw it to you, Ben, a question that I was initially going to pose to Leigh, and maybe when Leigh comes back, we could have his thoughts on it too. I guess first, I wanted Leigh to kind of break down what the actually existing Soviet system was and how it kind of functioned as its version of a command economy. But maybe, Ben, I should start with why the Soviet economy didn't, in fact, work. Like, what are some of the problems that it ran into, and why, after initially having really, there's Leigh. Okay, so Leigh, can you hear me okay? Oh, Leigh cannot hear us yet. Yeah, so
sorry, guys.
Yeah, it's all right. So I guess in that case, Ben, why don't you just take it from
sure
why the Soviet system didn't work, the actually existing Soviet system.
Yeah, right. So obviously, when Leigh sorts out his technical difficulties, I think he's going to be able to give a much more complete answer to this question, because I think that some of the historical and technical economic literature on this, I think he's just he's just immersed himself in much more. But I think in broad strokes, one of the the problems with the Soviet economy, not necessarily the only one, but one of the big ones was the lack of any sort of effective consumer feedback loop. Right? This is something that's really dramatized very well in Red Plenty. That different units of the economy, different state-owned enterprises, factories even had to meet certain planning targets, and they were very desperate to do that. But there was very little in the system that actually incentivized making stuff that people wanted or making it well. So one way to think about this, I remember. Seth Ackerman put it this way in his Jacobin piece, the Red and the Black. And again, this is very very well dramatized in Red Plenty, is that Soviet citizens were really disenfranchised as consumers. That you had that oftentimes again, there was very little disincentive for just making wildly shoddy products to just to meet production goals. You weren't really going to be punished for that in any way. Oftentimes, those production goals were set in ways that really didn't have any way to sort of match up with fine-grained consumer preferences. That what was being produced is what people actually wanted to buy, and I think that the reason this is worth emphasizing, and maybe when Leigh is back, we can have a more interesting discussion where there might be some disagreement and debate about this. But one reason this is worth emphasizing is that we often, again, people in that sort of tradition of anti-Stalinist Marxism, which is certainly a tradition with which I identify, but people in that tradition often talk about it as if the only flaw of the Soviet system was the lack of democracy. That the problem is that you had this elite group of state bureaucrats who were ruling instead of the workers, and so any sort of problems and inefficiencies in the Soviet model can be chalked up to that, and which is why I often think it's a useful thought experiment to imagine a version of the Soviet Union that was like the real one as much as possible, but you had political democracy. So all of these same enterprises were still owned by the state. You still had Gosplan, planning the whole thing in that beautiful building. But perhaps, thank you, Gail. But perhaps the head of Gosplan would be appointed by whatever party won a majority in that year's election. And so they could form a government, and you'd have real multi-party elections and free speech and freedom of the press. Well, that version of the Soviet Union most definitely would have been better. Right? I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that, both because we think, obviously, as democratic socialists, that free speech and real multi-party elections are goods in themselves, but also because of some of the most horrifying things that happened in the Soviet Union, and similarly, top-down planned economies, I don't think would have happened if Stalin or Mao or these other figures had to worry about getting reelected. I don't think there would have been grain being shipped out of the Ukraine, during a famine to sell to buy heavy machinery. I don't think there would have been a great leap forward in China if Mao had to worry about getting reelected. But the sort of day-to-day frustrations of Soviet consumers who, had pockets full of rubles, but, nothing to buy with them, had to sort of show up at the grocery store and hope that they had the products that they wanted and that they would work and all that stuff. I don't think that those necessarily would have been any different in a version of the Soviet Union that had free speech and a free press and multi-party democracy. Because it seems like just having the people who were doing the planning being appointed by people who won democratic elections wouldn't have necessarily done that. And then one tangent we could get into here, I know we obviously want to stick with what actually happened in the Soviet Union for the moment, but, is that there's a real dilemma here, because you can say, well, some of those problems might be solved if you had some really extreme form of direct democracy to have the consumer feedback loop that time. You have the, consumer federation that's constantly, tabulating everybody's preferences and putting it into the plan and everything. But then you have the opposite problem to the ones that Soviet citizens had, that Soviet citizens didn't really have very much say on this really as either workers or consumers. Instead, you'd have people having to spend their entire lives at meetings, which sounds horrifying, certainly to me.
So let's get to the real alternative or lack of later. And Leigh, I'm going to throw it to you, but I want to basically start or tee you up with a kind of very rough potted history of the Soviet Union, just so everyone can follow along, which is from the very beginning, Marxists had this idea that the anarchy of the market was particularly not suited for industrial capitalism. That instead of this system based on planning, based on instead of the system based on the anarchy of the market, we could have a system in which we nationalize the major factories, the major forces of production, and we could bring about both worker political democracy and this planned nationalized economy. This wasn't just a dream of the Soviet Union. This was a dream of the mainstream of the social democratic movement across Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century. By the 1920s, and the Soviet Union is starting to get formed, Lenin and the Soviets don't really think that that's possible in any serious way. They think that you're at best going to have this mixed economy for the foreseeable future of even a role for certain forms of private capital, but this mix of nationalizations, non-nationalized firms, mix of market and non-market. You have the growth of the NEP. You have this long period of slow and steady socialist accumulation was the goal. Obviously, Stalin changes that when he takes power and he has crash collectivization. Basically, everything's nationalized, and you have the modern Soviet economy as we knew it starting to develop. And it's pretty effective in the initial stages of cash up in building heavy industry, in forcing Soviet society to forego consumption and just put everything back into investment. So Stalin's goal was to make up in 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years in order to prevent Russia from being overcome by outside forces in his reading of history. And, obviously the caveats before about the tremendous human cost of that. But I'm wondering, Leigh, if you could just describe what actual central planning was, how things got made, what role Gosplan had. I know it's a huge question. It's basically a talk in itself, but just a quick version of what this system actually was and how commodities got made in this system.
Right. So the Soviet Union doesn't sort of come straight out, I'm hoping you just said, and I couldn't hear, but the Soviet Union doesn't come straight out of the gate in 1917 and start planning everything. In fact, if anything, the Soviet Union falls into economic planning in fits and starts as a result of shortages, sort of nationalizations that are happening without any sort of central decision making. This is where bosses at a particular factory would much prefer the state for them to take them over rather than the workers to take control. There are even periods where in Moscow they're basically issuing edicts saying like stop with the nationalizations, and it sort of falls into this process through shortages, blockages, this sort of thing, into a sort of war communism. This obviously has a disastrous sort of outcome, and then you have the sort of return of markets to some extent, particular in order to revive a movement of food from the rural areas, from the peasants that have been liberated into the cities, because of course there's no food production in the cities. And the peasants, once they're liberated, they have no incentive to produce any sort of surplus other than what they need to survive and reproduce their families. They have to be incentivized to produce something extra in order to trade with the cities for tractors or dresses or trowels or whatever it happens to be to establish that. So, I mean, one of the fundamental problems with the Soviet Union was that it was trying to start socialism in a basically largely feudal economy with tiny little bits of industry on the far west, and then sort of 1928. That is the very first. So you have a sort of retreat from the new economic policy of this market by Stalin. But again, it really is in fits and starts. They don't. It takes about a decade really for proper. The first 5-year plan is 1928, but it takes about a decade to properly get going. This is very, very different from, for example, the Otto Neurath, the Austrian economist and philosopher, who in the First World War, he was the head of the German War Ministry's sort of war planning department, and he begins to realize that in a war, in wartime circumstances, you increasingly tend towards sort of planning because markets have their own sort of profit incentive, which may not be aligned, that objective function may not be aligned with the particular objective function of the society at that time, which is to win the war. And he begins to think, oh, well, what if we apply that not for war making, but for a just society? And so he comes out of the First World War into the German Revolution in an industrialized country, and he begins to develop these sort of plans for Saxony, for Bavaria, later on in Red Vienna. But of course, all of those revolutionary movement was crushed. It was never properly sort of realized there. I would say one quick thing. I do disagree with some of what Ben had said earlier, in that even imagine a multi-party democracy with free speech, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but you still have this economic planning, you would still have these issues. I think the problem there is it still adheres to the conservative perspective that it was planning that led to the shortages, or even the planning led to the authoritarianism and the idea of the conservative critique of planning, rather than authoritarianism that undermines the planning. That is to say that, when the center was sending out people to just tally up the number of products, let's say, were being produced on a collective farm, and they were going there to begin to sympathize with the peasants and how they were being brutalized, and their food was being requisitioned, people were starving. They would come back and report, this is irrational, you can't do this. Those people were some of the very first people to be targeted in the gulags, in the purges. And what that did was that they were reporting accurately what was happening on the ground, and Stalin didn't want that. And so he would send in people who would tell him what he wanted to hear, which undermines the fidelity of the information system to reality. So again, it's the authoritarianism that undermines planning, not planning that causes authoritarianism.
So before I get Ben's reply, I guess the thing I was more interested in is less the history and more what do we mean by command economy and central planning? Not in our vision of it, but just the Soviet version of it. Like, how did a commodity get made loosely? Like where did the inputs come from? Where did the orders and directives come from? Since it wasn't operating by the laws of like supply and demand and market-based system for consumer goods and so on. So obviously every country has a bit of investment planning. The Soviet Union had planning everywhere at every level. Roughly, what do we mean by what was the Soviet system?
I mean, effectively evolves out of a system, a sort of series of input-output matrices, where you're sort of you're listing all the possible inputs, products in a society against all of the other sort of products in society, and seeing which ones require how much of each input, and then calculating that. And of course, the problem there is that the larger the number of rows and columns in that matrix, the ever more complicated the calculation has to be. But the second part about it is not just the problem there is not just the calculation of that matrix. It's also, where do you get that information from without the market? I mean, this is why the socialist calculation, the conservative argument within the socialist calculation debate is probably the strongest argument that has ever been mounted against socialism. Is you would have to have this army, or apparently you would have to have this army of bureaucrats going and tracking all of this data across the entirety of the economy. How on earth do you manage something like that?
Right. So, in other words, Ben, we would need to not only figure out, like at the peak, according to Alec Nove, the Soviet Union had 12 million different items, if you count different sizes of things and whatever else. So you would not only need to know how many of those 12 million items need to be produced and how many inputs, how much raw material should go to the factories producing those items, but you would also need to know where those items should go, out of thousands of possible locations. So it's actually a wonder that the Soviet Union was pretty effective, and in a way, right? It's actually like it shows, I think, a lot of the skills and kind of things, knowledge and expertise were developed by these planners. And obviously, the Soviet Union was pretty effective in building a heavy industrial society in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The problem is it never transitioned beyond that. It never transitioned to the point where it was able to produce plastics and keep up in aeronautics and commuting and whatnot for a variety of reasons. But Ben, I had a perfect question to tee you off on, but I figured I would let you reply to Leigh first.
Yeah, well, I think that should be relatively quick, and we can do your perfect question after that. But I actually, I think I mostly agree with Leigh's formulation that about planning and authoritarianism. That, in other words, I don't think that the planning was the cause of the authoritarianism, and I do agree that the authoritarianism contributed to making the planning worse than it would have otherwise been. Where I would plant my flag is on saying that we can't blame the authoritarianism for all or probably even most of the failures of the planning. So, and this is where that little, simplistic thought experiment that I trotted out earlier, comes in, right? Imagining the version of the Soviet Union with multi-party elections and the rest. And that version is, that thought experiment very deliberately, sort of mimics, bourgeois parliamentary democracy. And of course, I know people will say, oh, but that's not what we have in mind. We have in mind something much more radically democratic. But I think one of the reasons it's useful to start out by imagining the Soviet Union with standard parliamentary democracy is because it forces us to say, okay, if that wouldn't have solved most of the problems of the planning, what would have? And to force people to be much more specific instead of just doing this thing, which I know Leigh, who is one of the most thoughtful people that I know on these subjects. I mean, I know Leigh wouldn't do, but but lots and lots of leftists just sort of punt to these vague formulations about local control and things like that without really showing much sign of having thought about what that actually means or how it would solve the problem. But just really, quickly wrap it up. Like, I like Leigh's example because I think that helps us narrow in on what the actual issue is. So that when you had these people who were being sent by the state to the countryside, and they're bringing back this information about how bad it was, and at best that was being buried, and at worst they were being shot. Of course, in a version of the Soviet Union with more political freedoms, where none of that would happen, then I think it is plausible that those particular extreme problems, with Soviet planning would have been fixed. Where I'm more skeptical about is the idea that at least in Soviet Union plus parliamentary democracy and political freedoms, that the sort of normal date, like the Soviet Union in the 80s, right? Nobody in the 80s, was being shot for, saying something bad about Gorbachev. Nobody was starving, in a famine.
Well, I mean, I do think one of the crucial things about Red Plenty, which is the sort of most tantalizing aspect of it, is that it is set during the Khrushchev thaw. This is the moment where suddenly there is much more freedom to experiment with innovation in terms of planning and mathematics. Yeah. There is an expansion of consumer item production. This is the Sputnik moment, and then. There's the old guard within the Politburo who are very reluctant to this sort of opening up of free speech. I mean, one would never describe Khrushchev's Soviet Union as this incredible free speech sort of zone like the United States or something like that. But it probably was about the level of sort of control over what you could say or not say as under, say, de Gaulle's France. And then that was very quickly shut down. In fact, one of the main reasons that Khrushchev invades Hungary in 1956 is precisely because he is engaged in so much opening up that he's worried that there will be a coup if at this point he doesn't crack down on what's going on in Hungary.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Wait, I gotta just jump in with one thing. Sure. I do disagree. I mean, I think civil society was just far freer in de Gaulle's France. You had multi-party parliamentary democracy. You had a host of different independent journals and so. But I definitely take your point that it certainly wasn't a totalitarian society the way we would understand it. It was something quite different.
My point was more to the argument that people weren't being disappeared under Gorbachev. Sure, you're not having the purges, but what I wanted the crucial thing was that there was this Khrushchev thaw, opening things up considerably. Yeah, there wasn't multi-party democracy. That's absolutely true. But then after 1956. He got rid of precisely because of that. And so there was a return to authoritarianism. And that, I think, is, within Red Plenty, it's not touted as a rationale, but certainly that plays a role within why they never properly developed their own domestic computer.
To get us back.
All true. The only point I was making was that the things that I'm skeptical that more political freedoms and elections would have solved aren't stuff like what was going on, in the Stalin period, that you were talking about earlier. Absolutely. I completely concur that more political freedoms would have solved like those like horrors of like Soviet planning at its worst. What I'm more skeptical that more political freedom and elections would have solved were the sort of day-to-day frustrations that when the system was at its most liberal, right, which is still, had a lot to be desired, but when the system was at its most liberal, the sort of day-to-day frustrations of Soviet consumers, which I know you take seriously, but I mean, I would also say, in my experience, right, lots of socialists will sort of, shrug this off as not that important or whatever, but we certainly shouldn't. I mean, whatever, it's what your book is all about, but also it's, we certainly shouldn't, if nothing else, on a political level, because those day-to-day frustrations of Soviet consumers, even in the 80s, were a big part of why Soviet workers didn't fight to defend that system.
Yeah, absolutely.
So two things real quick. One is, I think the rationale for getting rid of Khrushchev in I guess 1964 or whenever Khrushchev was gotten rid of was in part that the Soviet Union, which had just defeated fascism and lost millions of people, in the process, was still growing economically and had achieved a basic level of food security, basic level of prosperity for people whose recent history had just been wars, civil war, famine, all sorts of maladies, Nazi invasion, whatever else, and that not that the system didn't have to be reformed, but what Brezhnev offered was stability, and and Khrushchev's kind of zany, big reforms and agriculture ideas were kind of seen as like they were disasters. So I think that was the main case against Khrushchev. But obviously, with him seemed to die any possibilities to really upend what wasn't working in the system. I think he was identifying things that would later prove to be really big problems. So growth rate was slowly stalling out, and by the 70s and 80s, you have kind of the Brezhnev era socialist growth of very very limited growth and lots of issues, even with the bonanza of Soviet oil kind of hiding problems in the system. I should say that it seems to me that where the free civil society comes in is some of the worst excesses and some of the worst problems of like the deaths and famines of collectivization and so on. It just wouldn't happen with a free civil society. In part, obviously in the Soviet Union, you had the issue of some of the famines being more deliberate and politically motivated, but a lot of the shortage was created by the misreporting from low and mid-level officials who didn't want to be punished for not missing their quotas, and basically saying, no, we actually have produced this much grain, we distributed this much grain, and same thing in the famine in China under Mao. You just can't imagine with the free flowing of information and a free civil society that same sort of excesses. But yes, a free civil society, like Ben was saying, doesn't make the shelves better stocked necessarily, and I'm sure you would agree. So Leigh, I want to throw this to. Can you explain briefly some of the reforms that were attempted in the Khrushchev era and that feature very large in Red Plenty to fix the Soviet system? Roughly, what these mathematicians and others were trying to do to improve the economic situation of the Soviet system and reform the existing system of central planning, even if it's just a rough sketch, because I think it's a really interesting part of the book and something I barely understand myself.
So the major innovation here at this point is, and this is one of the main characters with it, or the characters that plays a significant role within Red Plenty is Leonid Kantorovich, and he develops basically a new field of mathematics called linear programming, which allows for a more rational assessment of allocation, where you have sort of multiple different sort of objective functions there. And this, what's fascinating about this development of linear programming, I mean, this is studied in, you'll learn about linear programming in sort of upper level undergraduate business courses. Linear programming is used within, ironically, is used within large corporations to assess allocation questions without using, because of course within a large corporation, you're not going to use market mechanisms to engage in allocation. So there's this really, really interesting irony here that one of the great mathematical innovations that occurs during the Khrushchev thaw, ironically, is what allows large corporations today to engage in sort of not quite on the scale of the Soviet Union, but very close to, internal economies close to the scale of the Soviet Union at this time, with, more than 12 million product items there. There is just one quick thing that I wanted to return to. I want to agree with Ben on the issue of, there are a lot of socialists out there who, I mean, even when me and Michal were touring our book, there would be people who get up and say, this shows that calculation is not a problem. It's just a conservative, it's a matter of will, and we can just do it. And actually, I mean, one of the reasons that we say in our book that this is one of the greatest arguments ever mounted against socialism is precisely because it is hard. And it gets harder the further away you get from things like heavy industry, where you do have just a very relatively small number of inputs and outputs. And once you get to consumer items, yes, that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. What I would say, though, again with Red Plenty, is that this is the moment when the Soviet Union, because of the thaw comes at a particular time with the United and its relationship with the United States, which also allows it. One of the reasons there was such an emphasis on heavy industry was precisely to avoid, to make the tanks that would prevent any sort of foreign invasion. Now there's a relative freedom to go off and do this. At the time, but there were still difficulties engaging in doing this, precisely because the calculation is incredibly complex to keep up with the change of fashion from year to year with jeans or dresses or what it happens to be. And absolutely, we don't want just bread, we want roses too. And this is one of the reasons that I have a fairly strong criticism of some of the green left, where they imagine that we can just do away with all consumer items and in a perfectly constrained ecosystem. Highly constrained ecosystem. We don't.
There's a great quote.
Sorry, I would say we do need those as well. We need roses as well.
There's a great quote in Red Plenty about champagne. About I think I have it somewhere. I'll put it up. But basically, it was a poster. Yeah, the poster read, "Life has become better and more cheerful." Posters all over the place and advertised Soviet champagne, and the character kind of wonders whether Soviet campaign actually existed. But that was the goal. The goal was champagne. The goal was There's another passage in the book where the character, I think this is Khrushchev in the U.S., is kind of thinking about America as the model, in the sense that in England they still had handmade trousers. In France, it was still, cheese from cows who munched away on a hillside for eons. But in the US, it was efficiency. It was mass production. It was the creation of plenty by obviously different means. So what would it mean to create plenty, but without the capitalists and without the exploitation of man by man? And I think the Khrushchev moment was really unique, because when we think about actually existing planning in both the Soviet context, but also the context of the developing nations of the global South, nations like India, South Korea, Taiwan, all these sorts of nations that adopted to varying degrees planning, they were nations trying to catch up with the advanced capitalist world. So it wasn't quite what Marx had envisioned. And yes, I know about Marx's writing about Russia and about different paths towards socialism, but I think on the whole, Marx definitely didn't envision this sort of socialism starting in the periphery. But I think it really did change what the goals were. And if the goal was to go from semi-feudal underdevelopment to the satisfying of at least basic needs, which planning was able to do, then at an economic level, putting aside the political failings, authoritarianisms, and so on, at an economic level, it was a success. The thing is, it also had greater aspirations that it never came close to. And I think Khrushchev became a little bit inconvenient because he actually kept alluding to these aspirations, alluding to actually burying the left. It's a famous UN thing by 1980. So, Ben, I'm going to bring you in just 1 second, but I'm wondering, Leigh, whether you could explain what you mean when you say you're an advocate of a different type of planning in the 21st century, and what you mean when you offer your vision of socialism, which has a major role for planning. I think Ben and I's vision also has a major role for planning. But let's get into what Red Plenty in the 21st century should look like.
Right. So fundamentally, the problem in the United States with healthcare is not that nurses and doctors don't run the hospitals as a workers' co-op. The fundamental problem with healthcare in the United States is that a market-based healthcare system doesn't allocate healthcare in an egalitarian fashion. So that means that if we're going to do that, we're going to have to take that sector into the public to decommodify it. We have to rationally plan it. Now, healthcare is a lot more complicated in terms of planning than coal mines and steel mills. Nevertheless, in most Western countries, we have variations on unplanned public healthcare systems, ranging from Canada, where there's a single payer, but it's still largely in non-state hands, to the UK, where everything is state controlled. And in the case of the US, in all of these cases, you have much superior health outcomes, despite that enormous amount of calculation that has to happen. Now, alluding to what I was just saying a few minutes ago, there are a number of consumer items. There are consumer items which may be much more complicated to calculate. There's still an issue there with markets, insofar as if there is something that we know as society is useful to be produced, but it isn't profitable or isn't even sufficiently profitable, it won't be produced. And we can see that with antibiotics. So don't want to go into detail about that. I've talked about it many times before. Look at some of the other Jacobin talks to find out the rationale for that. So that's another sector that we would say, okay, well, let's take that into the public sector. It's not about co-ops. It's a workers' co-ops. It's about approach allocation. And so I would envision quite extensive parts of the economy, let's call them the commanding heights, that are the most necessary, the most urgent sectors of the economy to take in. But still, precisely because of this irrational allocation, the long-term vision would still be to try to slowly, over time, as technology changes and allows us to engage in greater and greater, more complex computation, to lean towards more and more more full decommodification. Alongside that, this sort of second goal of socialism, one is rational allocation, the other is sort of liberation of workers from domination in the workplace. And workers' co-ops are great at that, in terms of being these schools of working class confidence, teaching workers that the boss needs us, we don't need the boss, that we can run things ourselves. And so I would, if I, king of socialism, another socialists want kings, but you know what I mean. Very high on my list of pieces of legislation would be to try to set in incentives to maximize the number of workers' co-ops in society as rapidly as possible. But let's be very clear that workers' co-op oil company would still produce oil. A workers' co-op coal company would still produce coal. And a workers' co-op pharmaceutical company, a workers' Pfizer, would still not have the incentive to produce COVID vaccines without government shepherding of that market. So it would be a social democracy on steroids, I guess.
So Ben, I know you don't want a worker-owned Pfizer or oil company or whatnot, because those that we need, like coal, we could probably get rid of, but oil we'll still need for plastics and other stuff. But those that we need will be nationalized. So I want you to get into your mix of why you think that the commanding heights of the economy should be nationalized, and how you think they should be run and decommodified, but also why you think that the spare of consumer goods should be run by these worker cooperatives, these worker owners, rather than a different sort of system that maybe has less of a role for the markets, because presumably in this consumer sphere, the different worker-owned firms are still competing, and there could still be firm failure and whatnot.
Yeah. So I guess one thing I want to say first is that, I think probably all of the things that Leigh just mentioned are things that I would agree would be, better to be considered, part of those nationalized commanding heights. Because if we think about the things that we want to completely, in some of those cases, completely decommodify, I don't know about all of them, but, most of those cases completely decommodify, then we want, we really will have two desiderata there, right? One is that we can do it without it, without running into big logistical problems. And I think something everybody in this discussion has in common is that we do all take those logistical problems seriously. And then the other is that there are, it would be just very important in some way for those to be planned outside of the market. And those two don't always align, right? So food, for example, is pretty damn important as a human need. But as Leigh and Mikhail point out at the end of People's Republic of Walmart, that's where the greatest failures of economic planning have happened in terms of state ownership of food production. So maybe that's one of the ones that we should be, we should be most reluctant to fully take outside of the market. But I guess I would just say really quickly, like, I think that I like what Leigh said about those two goals of socialism. I think that that workers' control, even if it's exercised through worker cooperatives or something like worker cooperatives in a sector that still had market competition. I think sometimes, we, like people who spend too much time only talking to other people with very radical views, lose sight of just how exciting that would be. This would be the first society since the agricultural revolution, that wasn't divided into a ruling class and some sort of subservient labor force. That would be amazing. Do we want? So, is the only reason that we want consumer goods to be in a market that we have these worries, these computational worries, right? Well, I think it's certainly a major reason to want that. I think the other reason that I would take seriously, and I don't necessarily think this is an unsolvable problem, but I would take it seriously, is that I think there are legitimate concerns about the status of independent civil society if everything is nationalized or everything is decommodified. And again, that I'm open to being convinced on this, right? But let me just really quick lay out the worry, because I think if there is a disagreement, I think all three of us have the same idea of what kind of socialism we could have on like the day after the revolution. I think that we might all three be in slightly different places about what we would hope that to be, 30 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later. And so just really quickly, think about the worry, right? So it's not just a question of, most obviously, right? Like if Jacobin is nationalized and, I don't know, Reason is nationalized and, whatever, there's a concern about these things continuing to have independent editorial lines. I think you could, I think that you could probably convince me that there's a way around that. But then another concern is just, look, the means of production are, among other things, the means of production of opinions. If you have a think about Jacobin, especially the print manifestation of Jacobin. You're using various resources, like paper and ink and and the things like this, and so the one legitimate question about a completely decommodified economy would be how the distribution would be the distribution to various independent civil society organizations and how they stay independent. Again, I don't necessarily think that's an unsolvable problem, but that is one that would make me think twice about going, even in 50 years when advancing technology makes us able to, after the singularity or whatever, we're completely able to plan everything without worrying about computation problems. I might still worry a little bit about that.
Oh no, Bhaskar. In the meantime, I can respond to that just super quickly.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's a really, really interesting challenge. I think that's a novel idea, a novel critique of decommodification of everything. I think we're going to have to think really, really hard about what would that mean. I mean, I would say that I think we can see some hints of the sort of thing that we would see already, insofar as most scientific production that is basic research, is entirely decommodified, but it isn't state directed. The decision making on how what sort of scientific production occurs is done by scientists themselves. They have their own committees with their own fields deciding allocation. Like, the money does come from the government, but then the scientists themselves decide how that is allocated. So that there is still effectively a civil society. Civil society is producing scientific goods, but it is at the same time decommodified. And you have a similar sort of situation in Canada with the National Arts Council, where the funding for theatre, poetry, a lot of sort of artistic production that can't survive in the market, that the funding does come via tax from the government via taxes, but it isn't the government that decides, oh, this theater is going to get this money and this poet is going to get this chunk of money. It's a body of artists themselves who allocate it on, there's a sort of series of metrics that they come up with themselves to try and do it fairly. But again, that's effectively civil society rather than state-run theater. So I'm just saying that those are hints of maybe, although at the same time, I agree with you. I think that's a really, really good challenge to the idea of a decommodification of everything.
So I obviously I'm now, unlike Leigh, the one with the tech problems, so I just had to switch to my phone. But I kind of get the gist of what I said in the last minute or so, and I have to say, I think what Ben seems to be getting at is some of the soft budget constraints, I think, as it often is caused, that emerge in the central plan.
That's a slightly different. Well, I mean, okay,
but I mean at the let's just say at the level of allowing for failure. So in other words, if it's not just disciplining managers or whatnot. It's also the fact that if some of these firms are failing, if they're not producing enough goods or high enough quality goods, then there is a rational way they could be closed under any sort of more planned system, which is just you look at the benchmarks and you see the benchmarks and you see that this firm is not producing that effectively, so you could decide to restructure or reorient a firm. That's totally feasible.
Yeah,
I guess the question is there political pressure to make that harder than if this was a market mechanism doing that?
So just for the record, I think that is a good worry, but it's a slightly different worry than what I was talking about, which is whether you could have a robustly independent civil society in a society where everything is planned.
Oh, well, in that case, I actually might agree more with Leigh, because if you actually think about, let's say if you have a society where everything is planned through a form of more democratic planning, then in fact you could actually imagine a much more expansive civil society where more time is spent like learning and debating more things than just your sector. So if you're a worker owner in the newspaper business or the shipping business, you might know the ins and outs of that sector really well and keep up in your trade press or whatnot. But if you somehow imagine also being responsible for wider decision making and figuring out inputs, like I guess in the ideal world, you would actually have a more well trained and rounded civil society, and you might have kind of debates about different patterns of investment and consumption that I guess theoretically would exist in our vision of socialism too, because there still is that role for public banking and for commanding heights planning. But I could definitely see it operating. But again, I missed. I think I very
let me see if I can just do the 30-second version of the worry. Right, this is, and I. One of the things I said at the beginning is I'm not necessarily sold on that. This is just a worry I take seriously. I don't necessarily think it's unsolvable, but the worry would more be about the fact that if we think about like a magazine like Jacobin, that obviously relies on various production inputs, put out that beautiful print edition with the dead bird on it, then if all of those production inputs are entirely planned, I think you might have a legitimate worry about especially very unpopular views, not being able to be expressed, things like that. That's more the worry.
I think, I just, not to repeat what I just said, I do think there's ways around that through the independence of the press from the state. There's mechanisms we can imagine already. Actually, in fact, many journalist unions are trying to come up with conceptions of how you could have a state-funded but not state-directed free press in an era where advertising has completely collapsed. and I would also say that because within a planned economy, you now have or at least larger and larger amounts of the economy that's planned, you now have a second objective function there rather than just profit. So you can decide as a society, okay, in 20 years' time, we want to shorten the work week by another day, and then sort of like shepherd the economy to be able to do that. And as you have enough, you extend, or, steadily shorten the working week, you expand civil society, and along the lines of what Bhaskar was talking about there, expanding the amount of time that people can just do whatever they want to do. I do want to actually, Bhaskar, maybe because you mentioned firm failure there and soft budget constraints. I wouldn't mind responding about that.
So I was gonna say, I will let you respond to that, but I was gonna say I have this book right next to me, and sorry, I need to line it up with the right camera. I think we should do our next conversation just on People's Republic of Walmart, and we can get into this more in depth.
Yes,
but
please.
yeah, let me hear you on firm failure. Then I want to hear a stirring rebuttal from Ben. Then I'll bring it back to the book, and we'll wrap up and kind of to be continued. I'm sorry we lost like a good 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Yeah,
just for technical difficulties. But
I can't believe, by the way, that I'm doing this from in the middle of the woods in northern Michigan, and somehow I'm the only one of the three of us who hasn't had any tech problems.
And Lee's actually in the developed world. He's in Canada, I'm dealing with shitty New York internet. So.
Right. So this conception of soft budget constraints, this is the idea that in socialist economy, it comes from János Kornai, the Hungarian economist, the idea that there will be a tendency because for important firms to not fail despite chronic losses, right? You've got this important firm and it's been allocated a certain amount of stuff to produce it, because it can continue to, it knows that it will allow, it won't go under despite it overrunning its budgets. That you begin to, that's the source of like significant inefficiency creeping into the system. But here's the thing: János Kornai himself, who is a conservative economist or more neoclassical economist,
who became that. I think he started off kind of reform
absolutely.
Socialist.
And he's still alive. I just checked today; he's 92 years old. He's still kicking. So he later on in the 1990s started to write about how, in the late 1990s, began to write about how this was also occurring in capitalist societies. And the examples he was giving there was the saving and loans scandal in the 80s, where firms were not allowed to, were too big to fail. And then again, long-term capital management sort of crisis in 1997. And then we might also talk about soft budget constraints with respect to the too big to fail financial institutions in the 2008 crisis, or even too big to fail national economies in the Eurozone crisis, such as Greece or Italy, where otherwise it would have resulted in the crash of the breakup of the Eurozone system. And we should also talk about how this happened within market socialism, really existing market socialism in Yugoslavia, where crucial key industries, even if they were inefficient, there were taxes that were taken from the efficient firms and used to prop up those sectors, because you couldn't shut down those sectors. One, because either it was sort of like the loss of jobs, or it was just too important for the society. And then most recently, again back in a sort of regular capitalist system, not just too big to fail, but also crucially to the society, during the pandemic, we've seen bailouts of airlines, largely because we can't do without airlines. So Kornai here is a little bit more nuanced than we think, in that the reality is that soft budget constraints are something that all types of economies suffer from.
Yeah, I guess there's a difference between. So first of all, I think Yugoslavia, another great discussion we should have at some point. I've actually just been doing a lot of reading in Yugoslavia recently. I think the short of it is kind of managed to be in certain ways like the worst of both worlds, in that it was neither an efficient market economy nor especially intelligently planned investment.
I would totally recommend this guy, also from Verso.
Oh, okay.
It's an edited volume, but it has tons of stuff on the failure of Yugoslavia and what happened after.
The advantage of Tito's Yugoslavia was that it was just more liberal as a civil society, and like some of the experiments with self-management were interesting. And especially in the early years, what that meant at the shop floor level, there was a lot of really interesting leading cadre that were intellectuals. You should read The New Class and other books. Ben, I'll let you respond, but I think suffice to say also, one additional thing for Leigh is that I completely agree that these constraints exist in other sorts of societies in our current system. And also there are certain firms that we should not allow to fail because of market failure, because the cost of allowing it to fail and restructure would be too significant. And there's other, obviously, firms that are in such vital and strategic areas, they should not be subjected to market forces of competition at all. And even and obviously, forever, you know what I mean? I think we debate between us the different mixes of planning and markets in any socialist economy. But I think there are certain sectors that we want, for a variety of both practical but also moral and ethical reasons, we would want absolutely decommodified, planned, and so on. But Ben,
and that's what I think makes this.
Then I'll bring it home. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and I think that's what makes this a really interesting conversation, rather than the way that it is normally posited as this insurmountable conflict between market socialism and socialist planning. The reality is that the debate is really, other than I don't know, there's a handful of people who would be just like full on total market socialists, and other ones who'd be like, no, come on, day 2 of the revolution, everything's going to be nationalized. But those are really sort of fringe figures who I think honestly don't take the substance of the debate. They aren't familiar enough with the substance of the debate. The reality is the debate is actually how much, how fast, how far, when are we going to go, and when are we going to do this? And that's a much more interesting conversation.
And also whether, and as a normative goal, for me, the goal is the outcome. At a normative level, I don't necessarily prefer planning to markets in let's say consumer goods, if that makes sense. But I
do prefer planning to, or rather, let me put it another way. My hope is that everything could be planned, precisely because of the irrational allocation problem, because we were basically at that point we would have to say, give up on the vision of finally democratically deciding everything. That would be a great tragedy if that happens to be the case. If the evidence is over the course of a few hundred years of socialism, we find that we just can't 100% eliminate prices entirely from the economy. Well, that we've done our best.
Then again, though, markets without inequality and markets without class would be so fundamentally different than the markets we have now that it itself might be a vehicle of democracy rather than what it is now.
When we were planning this out, I half jokingly said that on the long-term question, I occupy the sensible center between Bhaskar and Leigh.
Third way, Ben Burgis.
That's right. So my revolutionary Marxist Blairist position is that I don't think it would be as much of a tragedy as Leigh does, but I also don't necessarily think that there's any particularly strong sense in which we should have a normative preference for planning for markets and consumer goods if technology got good enough that we could that we could plan in ways that would be as tight a fit with consumer preferences as markets would be, or maybe even almost as tight a fit, but they had other advantages. So I think, but I like what Leigh was saying about how we sort of imagine socialism already having come to pass in an initial form that, again, I think we probably all three agree on. Which, again, if you have, if you're talking to a certain kind of socialist on Twitter, they're like, oh, whatever, social democracy, who cares? Sure, you've expropriated the entire capitalist class and, instituted workers' control, and you have the first society without a ruling class to subservient labor form in, thousands of years, but, whatever, you haven't impressed me yet. But if we did create that society, and then there would be, I like what you say about the debates that you'd have about how much, how far, what would the, what should the goal even be, right? Should we think that, is there a point in which not only we couldn't practically do it, but we wouldn't want to? If so, where's that point? I think that it's something really worth emphasizing. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that I sometimes express hesitations about the term market socialism, even though obviously, I think as Bhaskar and I and our comrade Mike Beggs have been, working on this book about it, I think, I say this, but I think every single planning thing that, we've created for that book, all the Google Docs have market socialism somewhere in the name. So obviously I'm willing to use it in certain contexts, but I think the reason why I think it's maybe not preferable is because it really undersells one of the advantages of getting rid of the capitalist class, which is that we get to decide this stuff. Right, that all those debates, how much, how far do we even want to go? That under capitalism, markets tend to infiltrate into every domain of life, and there are reasons for that are intrinsic to the dynamics of of any markets. But I think I think the very big reason is just that you have this separate class of capitalists who can profit off of expanding markets to domains where most people would not want that to be. Now, I see Leigh making faces. I think we could maybe
wait, hold on. I don't think we could have another jumping point of a debate. Yeah, jumping off point for a debate. That's why
no.
Right after the holidays in January, let's do the People's Republic of Walmart. Let's finish these questions around People's Republic of Walmart. I should say though, the goal is to create a society that meets at the very minimum allows every human being to flourish. And if we're creating that sort of society and we're creating social democracy ×2 to get there, it'll be a lot easier to deal without the capitalist class. So
I would say that the owners, the workers owning a cooperative, they're the new capitalist class. Whether you have, I'll do this 30 seconds. Whether you have a single owner, family owning a firm, or a bunch of 300 shareholders, or you have 5,000 workers owning a firm, the dynamic within a market pushing you to do what you want needs to be done in order to expand a profit is exactly the same.
Yeah,
it doesn't change just because there aren't any bosses.
Yeah, so there I think there are some real disagreements. I think that some of some of the structural impulses to do that are the same, but I think the incentives are actually very different in really important ways.
You're trying to maximize profit per worker, for example, not overall profits necessarily. There are other changes, but also more importantly is why is it necessarily a bad thing these firms are trying to rapidly expand and develop economies?
Sure,
because then they will do what is necessary, not necessarily what is profitable, not necessarily what is beneficial.
Right, but when we talk about what's beneficial or not, I think oftentimes the brunt of that, is borne by people who actually work at these places, who are part of the local community, and so their incentives are different. Their incentives aren't completely different, but they are different, and I think those differences are, in fact, really important because now you have incentives in both directions, not just incentives in only one direction. And I think that I think that actually does matter a lot. But I also, but again, I'm sure we can, I
think that leans towards localism. That's basically a similar thing to the green argument that small businesses have will not pollute their local environment because they live there, whereas large corporations do. We've found that that's just not true. We have evidence along that line already with Arsenal Mining.
But I think let these firms pursue profits, let them expand, let them try to pollute, and then have a strong state to regulate and to whip them. I mean that'd be my view. But I think well,
that's the social democratic argument.
Yeah,
which is fine.
That's the social democracy is: do you think that program can be fully implemented at the same time as you have this powerful capitalist class, or do you think that in order for it to be fully realistic, you have to eliminate that separate capitalist class? And then I guess the difference between us and you on this is how much good you think that's going to do.
I would also say that I do think the issue of firm failure is a really, really crucial one, and difficult one for socialists to grapple with. We know from Mario Mazzucato, the Italian-American economist, that private firms are very, very bad at basic research and innovation. But the truth is that through that, the market does drive very small ratcheting upward of efficiency improvements. It is able to respond to fashion much faster. That set of things, if we were going to do that through a decommodified system, it's going to be really hard to figure out what is the incentive structure where we do that. And firm failure is a great incentive for that.
So I'm
saying it is hard.
Let's pick this up when we discuss People's Republic of Walmart. Kale, can you play us off with a tune and maybe a quote? I think there's a nice quote from Red Plenty that we should end on.
Okay.
Ben, this is like I'll give you the final word only because it's you. So I really wanted to end on this beautiful quote.
Okay, thanks, Bhaskar. I just wanted to say anybody who's not sick of watching me and Leigh talk about the Soviet Union can tune in to tomorrow night at 5 Eastern, and him and me and our comrade Nando Vila are going to be doing a live stream and give them an argument about Queen's Gambit, which actually has some interesting points of intersection with this. But yes,
Queen's Gambit, especially last episode, might as well be propaganda for like Brezhnev's Russia. It's like the most like flowery depiction of the Soviet Union history. Yeah. The ending is beautiful, very nice too. But anyway, I'll see you all later. Thanks to you both. Check out Leigh's book, check out Ben's book, check out
Red Plenty.
The show tomorrow. And yes, read Red Plenty. And thanks as usual to our producer, Cale Brooks.